The first luxury home sank on a Tuesday, quietly, like the earth had finally decided it was done holding up lies. Brick steps split down the middle, a front door jammed so hard it looked welded shut. Fresh landscaping wrinkled as the ground dropped in a slow, nauseating ripple. By nightfall, a second house had a foundation crack wide enough to swallow a hand. The HOA called it an unpredictable soil event, but the creek behind the neighborhood already knew the truth. Evan Mercer had bought the last modest property bordering the new development because it came with something the subdivision couldn't manufacture, a strip of mature woods and a shallow creek that ran year-round. He wasn't sentimental about it in a poetic way, he just respected how water behaved. He had spent years doing stormwater inspections for commercial sites before switching to a quieter job and a quieter life. The creek was small, but it was honest. It rose after heavy rain, cut its own path, and drained the low ground the way it always had. Then the luxury neighborhood arrived behind his fence like a glossy brochure made real. Fresh sod rolled out like carpet, retaining walls stacked up, decorative boulders appeared where nature never placed them. And with it came an HOA that treated the outdoors like an interior space that could be rearranged for taste. At first, Evan watched from a distance as the board pursued perfection. Identical mailboxes, curated shrubs, and a near-religious devotion to uniformity. The warnings were subtle, but they were there. Survey flags disappeared overnight. Drainage swales got flattened to make mowing easier. Contractors parked too close to the creek and left tire ruts that filled with water and stayed wet long after the sun returned. Evan kept expecting someone to ask a basic question about the stream, the floodplain, or the runoff the new roofs were funneling downhill. Nobody did. The HOA didn't look at the creek like a system. They looked at it like a blemish. The first pressure came in the form of paper. Evan's mailbox started collecting violation notices, even though he didn't belong to the HOA. His property, older and outside their plat, had always been separate. That detail didn't matter to a board that had gotten used to obedience. They complained about unmanaged vegetation along his creek line, about fallen limbs in the woods, about the unsightliness of a natural bank that didn't match their sculpted lawns. Soon the board's attention narrowed onto one thing, the creek's bend where it brushed the backyards of their most expensive homes. It was a shallow curve that ate a little soil every spring. Evan knew it was ordinary slow erosion, the kind that stabilized if you left it alone and kept heavy equipment away. The HOA treated it like a threat to property values, and threats demanded action. Survey stakes appeared along the bank on a Friday. On Monday, orange fencing went up. By Wednesday, a contractor's skid steer idled near the waterline, and the ground shook with the kind of work that never ends well near saturated soil. Evan documented everything the way his old job had trained him to. Dates, photos, water levels after rain, the slope angle of the bank, the tire tracks that cut channels straight toward the stream. He even set up a discreet camera facing the corner of his property line because the contractor kept crossing the boundary as if ownership were just another rule the HOA could rewrite. The escalation became personal when the board tried to restrict access. They installed a section of fence that subtly stole a few feet of Evan's creek frontage, then treated his removal of it as vandalism. Another packet arrived, this time framed as legal notice, even though it was printed on generic paper and signed by an HOA president who loved authority more than accuracy. Then came the real move, concrete trucks. The HOA had decided the bend needed to be hardened. Their solution wasn't bioengineering or riprap or a properly designed retaining structure. It was speed. It was finality. They formed a rough channel mold and began pouring concrete directly into the creek bed, choking the natural flow and sealing the stream like a drain they could cap. Evan watched wet gray slurry roll where water should have moved. The creek narrowed, then climbed over the new obstruction, looking for a way around. In a single afternoon, they turned a living drainage into a bathtub with nowhere to empty. He filed complaints with the county stormwater office and the state environmental line, attaching time-stamped footage and aerial images. He expected bureaucracy. He didn't expect the HOA to counterattack. A letter arrived accusing him of tampering with community drainage and harassing contractors. Someone started reporting him for imaginary violations, parking too close to the street, leaving trash bins out, operating surveillance equipment. A board member even approached his property line with a clipboard and a certainty that rules applied wherever they stood. Evan kept recording, he kept submitting, and the creek kept rising behind the concrete plug, pressing against soil that had never been designed to hold that much water for that long. The first heavy storm of the season hit like a stress test. Water surged down from the luxury roofs and compacted lawns, met the concrete blockage, and spread sideways into the ground. The woods on Evan's side turned spongy, the backyards on their side turned soft. For days afterward, puddles remained where none had ever lingered, as if the neighborhood had developed a bruise that refused to heal. Then the complaints changed tone. Residents started noticing dampness at the edges of patios, mulch beds slumped, a brand new stone walkway developed a subtle wave. The HOA posted cheerful updates about ongoing landscape improvements, but the ground had started keeping its own records.
Months later, the houses began to move. It started with small distortions that homeowners blamed on settling because settling was normal and comforting. But normal settling didn't make a garage slab drop at one corner like it had stepped off a ledge. Normal settling didn't twist a window frame until the glass cracked from pressure. The most expensive home on the bend was the first to show a full foundation fissure. The crack ran from the base of a front column across the facade like a lightning bolt frozen in stone. Within a week, 2 neighboring homes showed stair-step fractures in the brick veneer, and the ground along their back fences dipped in long, shallow troughs. Evan knew what was happening even before the inspectors arrived. Water had been forced into soil that stayed saturated. Saturated soil lost strength. Compacted fill from the subdivision's construction had been laid and shaped for appearance, not for hydrology. And now, underneath the perfection, the ground was liquefying in slow motion. When the county finally responded, it did not arrive with gentle suggestions. It arrived with clipboards, measuring rods, and the kind of silence that follows obvious wrongdoing. The inspectors walked the creek line and stopped at the concrete like it was a crime scene. They traced the wetness that spread beyond the channel, followed the seep lines into the backyards, and marked spots where the earth gave underfoot. Evan provided his documentation in a neat chain: footage of the pour, property line crossings, rainfall dates, and photographs showing how water pooled after the channel was sealed. He also provided the one thing the HOA hadn't expected him to have, an engineer's assessment he'd paid for out of pocket, describing how the obstruction created hydraulic pressure and redirected flow into the neighborhood's unstable fill. The HOA tried to redirect blame toward unusual weather patterns and pre-existing soil conditions, but their own records betrayed them. The contractor invoice listed creek bed stabilization, concrete infill. The board's meeting minutes described a plan to eliminate the unsightly water feature behind the premium lots. The power shifted in a single afternoon.
A stop work order went up. The county referenced state waterway protections and permitting requirements the HOA had ignored. And as soon as insurers learned the drainage had been altered without permits, the word denial began to hover over the neighborhood like a storm cloud that wouldn't move on. The HOA president's authority, once effortless, started collapsing under the weight of visible damage and undeniable paper trails. The homes didn't just look imperfect now, they looked unsafe. The consequences didn't land all at once. They arrived in waves, like water reclaiming space. First came the restoration order. The concrete had to be removed, the creek bed rebuilt, and the banks stabilized using approved methods. That meant heavy equipment, engineered plans, and months of disruption, exactly what the HOA had tried to avoid by taking shortcuts. Next came fines tied to environmental violations and sediment control failures, costs that quickly exceeded what proper work would have cost in the first place. Then the lawsuits began, not from Evan, but within the subdivision. Homeowners whose houses had shifted demanded answers the board couldn't soften with newsletters. Some had to pay for temporary shoring. Others faced underpinning work that turned pristine basements into construction zones. A few lots near the bend became unsellable until engineers signed off, and even then, the stigma stuck like a watermark. The HOA board didn't survive the season. Emergency meetings turned into recall petitions. Residents who once cheered community standards suddenly wanted to know why standards hadn't included permits, hydrology, or basic common sense. The president resigned before the vote could remove her, and the remaining members scattered responsibility the way the creek used to scatter leaves, until the county forced the issue and names became signatures. Evan's life didn't become triumphant in a cinematic way. It became quiet again, which is what he'd wanted from the start. The creek resumed its path, newly protected and monitored. The neighborhood installed proper drainage and adopted policies that required independent review for any work near waterways. For a while, trucks kept coming and going, not to beautify, but to repair. And whenever someone in that subdivision looked at the restored creek, they had to face a simple reality. Nature doesn't negotiate with committees. The only question was why it took sinking luxury homes for them to learn it.